The hospital is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where sickness is met with science and vulnerability is met with compassion. The doctor, draped in a white coat, is the ultimate symbol of that trust, a figure we empower with the authority to heal us. But what happens when that sacred trust is not just broken, but perverted into something monstrous? What happens when the person holding the singe, the one you look to for life-saving care, is a predator who gets high on the thrill of watching you die? Michael Swango was the all-American boy, handsome, intelligent, and a decorated former Marine. He seemed destined for a brilliant career when he entered Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. To his classmates, he was charming and dedicated. But beneath the polished surface, a dark obsession was taking root. He filled his notebooks not just with medical diagrams, but with detailed accounts of car crashes, disasters, and violent deaths. He was fascinated with poisons, particularly arsenic, studying their effects with an intensity that went far beyond academic curiosity. His peers saw it as a morbid quirk, the gallows humor of a future doctor. They had no idea they were witnessing the quiet cultivation of a serial killer. His true nature began to surface during his surgical internship at Ohio State University in 1983. A wave of mysterious and terrifying incidents began to plague the hospital floors where Swango worked. Healthy patients would suddenly suffer violent, inexplicable seizures. Others would stop breathing without any warning. Nurses noticed a chilling pattern. These code blue emergencies always seemed to happen on Swango's watch, often with patients who were recovering well. One nurse, walking into a room, saw Swango injecting something into a patient's IV line just moments before the woman suffered a near-fatal respiratory arrest. She reported him, but with no hard proof. Her suspicions were dismissed. The bodies continued to pile up, the string of unlucky deaths following him like a shadow. After being pushed out of the Ohio State program for poor performance, not for the trail of corpses he left behind, Swango took a job as an emergency medical technician in Quincy, Illinois. His co-workers there soon learned about his dark side firsthand. He began bringing in donuts and iced tea for his fellow paramedics, a seemingly kind gesture that was, in fact, a series of twisted experiments. One by one, his colleagues would be struck down by violent, debilitating nausea and stomach pains after eating his gifts. An investigation revealed the food was laced with arsenic. For this calculated mass poisoning, Michael Swango was convicted, but shockingly, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, serving only 2. A felony conviction for poisoning should have been the permanent end of any medical career. But for a master manipulator like Swango, it was just an obstacle to be overcome. Upon his release, he embarked on a campaign of breathtaking deception. He legally changed his name, forged documents, and simply lied on his applications, omitting his prison record. Incredibly, it worked. He was accepted into a residency program at the University of South Dakota. The pattern began again. Patients started dying under mysterious circumstances. When his true identity and criminal past were finally uncovered, he was fired. But once again, he faced no criminal charges for the new wave of suspicious deaths. He fled to New York, where he lied his way into another residency program at Stony Brook University Hospital, this time using a masterful story about being the victim of a frame-up by jealous colleagues. And again, the strange and sudden deaths of his patients began to mount. It was here that he poisoned a patient named Baron Harris with a fatal injection, a crime he would later admit to. When his lies finally caught up to him in New York, he simply vanished, embarking on the most terrifying chapter of his murder spree. In 1994, he used a forged resume and glowing letters of recommendation to get a job at a remote missionary hospital in Zimbabwe. In the understaffed and chaotic environment, he was finally unleashed. Local doctors and nurses nicknamed him Dr. Death as they watched their patients die in droves under his care. Their symptoms, paralysis, strange seizures, all pointing to poisoning. The net finally began to close when the relentless efforts of a few key people, the Dean of Stony Brook who had fired him, determined journalists, and the producers of the TV show 2020, brought his international killing spree to the attention of federal authorities. In 1997, as he was waiting in Chicago's O'Hare Airport to board a flight to Saudi Arabia, where he had already secured another medical position, FBI agents arrested him. He was initially charged only with fraud for lying on his applications, but prosecutors, led by a tenacious U.S. attorney, slowly and methodically built the murder case against him, connecting with authorities in Africa and exhuming the bodies of his American victims. Faced with the death penalty in both New York and Ohio, Michael Swango finally struck a deal. In 2000, he pleaded guilty, admitting in a cold, emotionless voice to murdering 3 patients in New York and 1 in Ohio. He also admitted to poisoning countless others. In exchange for his confession, he was spared execution and sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of August 2025, Michael Swango, now 70 years old, is incarcerated at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, locked away with the nation's most dangerous criminals. He's a chilling testament to the failures of a system that allowed a convicted poisoner to keep his white coat, transforming a symbol of healing into a shroud of death that stretched across 2 continents. In the small English market town of Hyde, Dr. Fred Shipman was more than just a family physician. He was a pillar of the community. For over 2 decades, he was the man residents trusted with their deepest fears and their most vulnerable moments. With his reassuring bedside manner and tireless work ethic, good old Dr. Shipman cared for generations of families, celebrating their births, mending their illnesses, and comforting them in their final hours. He was seen as a saint, a throwback to an era of compassionate, small-town medicine. But what if that saintly facade was a mask for something truly demonic? What happens when the most beloved man in town is secretly the most prolific serial killer in modern history? Harold Shipman's method was as simple as it was diabolical. The vast majority of his victims were elderly women, patients who trusted him implicitly. He would arrive at their homes for a routine house tour, a comforting presence in their quiet lives. There, in the privacy of their own living rooms, he would administer a fatal overdose of diamorphine, pure, medical-grade heroin. After watching them die, he would alter their medical records, falsifying the cause of death to reflect the common ailments of old age, like a heart attack or a stroke. In many cases, he, as the attending physician, was the one who certified the death, making him the sole authority on both the murder and its cover-up. He was the executioner and the coroner, all rolled into one. For over 24 years, from 1975 to 1998, Shipman killed with chilling regularity, a silent predator hiding in plain sight. He murdered his patients in the places they felt safest, their deaths dismissed by their families as the sad but expected course of nature. The true scale of his crimes is almost impossible to comprehend. A formal public inquiry, known as the Shipman Inquiry, officially confirmed that he murdered at least 218 of his patients, though the real number is believed to be closer to 260. He didn't kill in a frenzy. He killed methodically, consistently, one patient at a time. A slow, patient, and nearly invisible genocide of the elderly. The question that continues to haunt investigators and criminologists is why? Shipman never offered an explanation. He maintained his innocence to the very end. Was it a god complex, a perverse thrill derived from holding the ultimate power of life and death in his hands? Was he a mercy killer in his own twisted mind, deciding when his patients' lives should end? Or was it something simpler and more terrifying, that he just enjoyed the act of killing? Unlike other medical murderers, his motive was not overtly sexual or financial, at least not at first. He was a collector of lives, driven by a quiet, internal compulsion that remains a terrifying mystery. After decades of flawless deception, it was not brilliant detective work that brought him down, but a single act of breathtaking arrogance and greed. His final victim was Kathleen Grundy, the wealthy 81-year-old former mayor of Hyde. Shortly after her death in 1998, a crudely typed will mysteriously appeared. It left her entire estate, worth nearly £400,000, to one person, her beloved physician, Dr. Harold Shipman. The will was so clumsy and amateurish that it immediately aroused suspicion. Mrs. Grundy's daughter, who was a lawyer, knew instantly that it was a forgery. She alerted the police, and the first thread of Shipman's hidden world began to unravel. The investigation that followed was a slow, horrifying excavation of the truth. Mrs. Grundy's body was exhumed, and a toxicology report revealed lethal levels of diamorphine. This discovery prompted police to look at the death certificates Shipman had signed over the years. They found an impossibly high death rate among his patients, particularly elderly women who died at home. More exhumations followed, and each one told the same story: a healthy patient, a sudden death, and a body full of medical-grade heroin. Investigators discovered that Shipman had been prescribing massive quantities of the drug for years, stockpiling his murder weapon in plain sight. In the year 2000, Harold Shipman was put on trial, but only for 15 sample cases of murder. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, with the judge's recommendation that he never be released. The formal inquiry that followed his conviction concluded he had been killing for decades and exposed the catastrophic failures of the medical and legal systems that allowed him to operate undetected for so long. On January 13, 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman committed his final act of control. He hanged himself in his prison cell, taking all of his secrets and explanations with him to the grave. He offered no confession, no apology, and no remorse. As of August 2025, the name Shipman remains a dark specter in medical history. He shattered the sacred trust between doctor and patient on an unprecedented scale. A chilling reminder that the most prolific and terrifying monsters are often the ones we trust, respect, and invite into our homes. The cancer diagnosis is one of the most terrifying moments in a person's life. In an instant, the world shrinks, and all hope is placed in the hands of one person, the oncologist. You trust their every word, endure the most grueling treatments on their recommendation, and place your absolute faith in their expertise to guide you back to health. But what if that doctor isn't your savior? What if he's the one making you sick, intentionally poisoning you with drugs you never needed, all to turn your body into his personal ATM? In the affluent suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, Dr. Farid Fata was a titan of medicine. He was one of the state's most prominent cancer specialists, a charismatic and supposedly brilliant doctor who ran a massive, state-of-the-art practice with 7 clinics and an in-house pharmacy. To his thousands of patients, he was a miracle worker, a compassionate genius who was their last, best hope against a deadly disease. He was praised in the community, respected by his peers, and built a healthcare empire that made him incredibly wealthy. But his entire empire was built on a foundation of lies, greed, and systematic torture. Dr. Fata's crime was monstrous in its simplicity. He told healthy people they had cancer. He would diagnose patients who were perfectly healthy or who were in complete remission with aggressive, life-threatening cancers that required immediate and extensive treatment. The diagnosis alone was a form of psychological terror, shattering families and plunging his victims into a world of fear and despair. Then, the real horror would begin. He subjected these healthy men and women to the agony of chemotherapy, a brutal and toxic treatment that ravaged their bodies. He prescribed years of these infusions, knowing full well they were completely unnecessary. This was not about a god complex or a thrill for killing. It was about pure, unadulterated greed. Each IV drip, each injection, each round of therapy was a charge he could bill to Medicare and private insurance companies. He turned his patients into perpetual profit centers. He deliberately gave them the most expensive drugs at the highest possible doses to maximize his reimbursements. He ran his clinic like a factory, herding patients through, sometimes treating up to 50 a day, in sessions that were so brief he barely had time to speak to them. His victims suffered the horrifying side effects of chemotherapy for no reason. Their immune systems were destroyed, their teeth rotted and fell out, their bones weakened, and their organs began to fail. He was not treating a disease, he was inducing one. The sheer scale of his cruelty was breathtaking. He gave chemotherapy to a man for a tumor that never existed. He treated another patient for 2 different types of cancer, when in reality, the man had neither. He told a woman who had been in remission for years that her cancer had returned, condemning her to 2 more years of needless, debilitating treatments. Perhaps most depraved of all, he administered chemotherapy to patients who were at the very end of their lives, forcing them to spend their final, precious days in agony, all so he could squeeze a few last dollars from their insurance policies. For years, Fata operated with impunity. His patients trusted him, and other doctors were hesitant to question such a powerful and successful figure. The man who finally brought him down was not a detective or a federal agent, but a courageous office manager named George Carnage. Hired to run Fata's practice, Carnage quickly saw the horrific fraud unfolding. He saw the falsified records, the impossible number of treatments, and the terrified patients being herded through the clinic. Horrified, he began to secretly collect evidence and took his findings to the authorities, blowing the whistle on one of the largest healthcare frauds in American history. The federal investigation that followed was swift and shocking. When the FBI raided Fata's clinics in 2013, the full scope of his evil was laid bare. Investigators identified over 553 victims and found that he had fraudulently billed insurance companies for over $17 million. In court, the victim impact statements were heartbreaking. One by one, the people he had poisoned stood up and described how he had not only destroyed their health, but stolen years of their lives, leaving them with permanent physical and psychological scars. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, Farid Fata pleaded guilty to healthcare fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. In 2015, he was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. During his sentencing, the judge told him, "You did not just shame yourself, you shamed your profession." As of August 2025, Farid Fata is serving his sentence in a federal correctional institution in South Carolina. His medical license has been revoked, and his empire has crumbled. His name is now synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of the Hippocratic Oath, a doctor who didn't just fail to do no harm, but who actively and systematically inflicted it for profit. When a woman faces a difficult and desperate choice, the clinic is supposed to be a place of safety, sterility, and non-judgmental care. She places her trust in a doctor to abide by the law and the standards of medicine, especially when she is at her most vulnerable. But what if that clinic is not a sanctuary, but a filthy, blood-soaked slaughterhouse? What if the doctor is not a physician, but a butcher, running a house of horrors that defies human comprehension? For nearly 3 decades, in a distressed corner of West Philadelphia, Dr. Kermit Gosnell ran a clinic called the Women's Medical Society. To the outside world, and especially to the poor, immigrant, and minority women of the community, he presented himself as a medical champion for the underprivileged. He was one of the few local doctors who would perform abortions, often for cash and with few questions asked, creating a veneer of public service. This facade was the perfect shield, allowing him to operate a criminal enterprise of almost unimaginable depravity, hidden in plain sight from health inspectors and law enforcement who repeatedly failed to look closer. The clinic itself was not a medical facility. It was an abattoir. Investigants who finally raided the building in 2010, initially on a tip that Gosnell was running a massive pill mill for prescription drugs, were met with a scene from a nightmare. The air was thick with the foul stench of urine, anesthetic, and human decay. The linoleum floors were stained with blood and grime, and the waiting room furniture was ripped, soiled, and covered in cat urine-soaked blankets, as Gosnell allowed cats to roam freely, defecating wherever they pleased. Medical equipment was ancient, broken, and caked with the blood of previous patients. Surgical instruments were not properly sterilized between procedures. Some were simply rinsed in a dirty sink, spreading infection and disease from one woman to the next. In the basement, investigators found a grotesque gallery. Bags, milk jugs, and even cat food containers were filled with the illegally aborted remains of countless fetuses, stored for months or even years. Gosnell's staff was a collection of untrained, unlicensed, and often desperate individuals. His wife, Pearl, who had no medical training, regularly assisted in procedures. Other employees, some with only a 6th grade education, were tasked with complex medical duties. Most horrifyingly, a 15-year-old high school student was routinely put in charge of administering intravenous anesthesia, giving powerful narcotics to patients without any understanding of the risks or proper dosages. This was not a medical staff. It was a crew of unqualified accomplices in a criminal conspiracy. His primary business was performing illegal late-term abortions, far beyond Pennsylvania's 24-week legal limit, often on women who were 7, 8, or even 9 months pregnant. But his most monstrous crime was what he did when these brutal procedures resulted in a live birth. According to the chilling testimony of his own staff, it was a routine occurrence for viable, breathing babies to be delivered into a toilet or a plastic pan on the floor. When this happened, Gosnell had a standard procedure. He would take the living, sometimes crying or squirming infant, and plunge a pair of surgical scissors into the back of its soft neck, severing the spinal cord. He casually referred to this act of murder as snipping. His staff witnessed him do this hundreds of times, a cold, mechanical, and repeated act of infanticide. As a final, grotesque flourish, he kept a collection of severed baby feet in specimen jars, lined up on a shelf, not for any medical purpose, but as trophies of his slaughter. His complete disregard for human life inevitably extended to his adult patients. In 2009, Karnamaya Monga, a 41-year-old refugee who had fled persecution in Bhutan and had only been in the United States for 4 months, came to his clinic for an abortion. She was given a lethal overdose of sedatives by Gosnell's untrained and unlicensed staff. When she went into cardiac arrest The clinic's defibrillator was broken, and no one on staff was trained in CPR. Instead of calling 911 immediately, Gosnell's team waited, losing precious minutes that sealed her fate. She was dead on arrival at the hospital. The 2010 federal drug raid finally pulled back the curtain on his decades of horror. The agents who entered the building were stunned, describing it in the subsequent grand jury report as a house of horrors, and by far the worst they had ever seen. The report itself was a 281-page document of almost unbearable detail, outlining the filth, the fraud, and the murders that took place within the clinic's walls. It painted a damning picture of a medical system and state regulatory agencies that had catastrophically failed for 30 years to shut him down, despite numerous complaints and clear evidence of malpractice. In 2013, Kermit Gosnell was put on trial. The testimony was a procession of stomach-churning horror. He was ultimately convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder for the infants he had snipped, involuntary manslaughter in the death of Karnamaya Mungar, and over 200 other charges, including racketeering and performing illegal abortions. In a deal with prosecutors to spare himself the death penalty, Gosnell gave up his right to appeal. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison, ensuring he would die behind bars. As of August 25, 2025, Kermit Gosnell, now in his mid-80s, is incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Huntington in Pennsylvania. His clinic has been demolished, but his case remains a permanent and horrifying stain on American medical history, a chilling testament to how a monster was allowed to flourish for decades, preying on the desperate and the vulnerable, protected by a system that simply refused to look away. He was a respected doctor and a successful lawyer, a prominent figure in his devout Mormon community, and the proud patriarch of a large, beautiful family. To the outside world, Dr. Martin McNeil's life in Pleasant Grove, Utah, was a picture of American success. A loving husband to a former beauty queen, Mikkel, and a doting father to their 8 children. His family portrait was the very definition of idyllic. But what if that perfect image was a carefully constructed lie? What if the loving father was a master manipulator, a pathological narcissist who would use his deep medical knowledge not to heal, but to orchestrate the perfect murder of his own wife? For years, Martin McNeil lived a secret life of serial adultery and breathtaking deceit. While cultivating the image of a righteous family man, he engaged in numerous affairs, lying to his wife and family with pathological ease. His arrogance was matched only by his sense of entitlement. By 2007, he was deeply involved with a younger woman named Gypsy Willis and had decided his wife of nearly 30 years, Michelle, was an obstacle to his new life. But a divorce would have been financially costly and socially disastrous, tarnishing his esteemed reputation in the community. So, the doctor devised a plan not to leave his wife, but to eliminate her. The first step in his cold, calculated plot was to convince Michelle she needed a facelift. Michelle, a vibrant and healthy 50-year-old, had no desire for cosmetic surgery, but Martin was relentlessly persuasive. He insisted it would help her feel better and that it was a necessary procedure. His true motive was sinister. Major surgery would provide the perfect cover, a legitimate reason for his wife to be prescribed a powerful cocktail of post-operative narcotics. He wasn't just a supportive husband. He was an architect, laying the foundation for a murder that he could blame on a tragic post-surgical accident. After the surgery, Dr. McNeil immediately took full control of his wife's recovery. He personally instructed the plastic surgeon on which specific drugs to prescribe, requesting a dangerous and unusual combination of Valium, Ambien, Percocet, and Lortab. He then began to systematically over-medicate Michelle, keeping her in a drugged, incoherent state. His own daughters grew alarmed, watching their once vibrant mother become a helpless zombie under their father's care. He would mix the crushed pills into food and drinks, forcing them on her when she was too sedated to resist. He was not nursing his wife back to health, he was priming her for the final act. On the morning of April 11th, 2007, just 8 days after the surgery, the moment arrived. McNeil sent his youngest daughter, 6-year-old Ada, to a neighbor's house on an errand. When she returned, she discovered a horrifying scene. Her mother was submerged and unresponsive in the family's bathtub, with her father making a frantic but strangely ineffective show of trying to save her. Paramedics arrived to find McNeil dead. Martin McNeil, the grieving husband, told a convoluted story about his wife accidentally overdosing on her pain medication and drowning. The medical examiner, finding no obvious signs of foul play, initially ruled her death natural, caused by heart disease, complicated by the drugs in her system. To the world, it was a tragedy. To Dr. McNeil, it was the perfect murder. But he had severely underestimated the intelligence and resolve of his own children. His daughters, particularly Alexis and Rachel, were immediately suspicious. Their father's behavior was not that of a grieving husband. At the funeral, he was seen laughing and joking, telling guests that his wife had passed away and was now in a better place. Their suspicions turned to horror just 2 weeks after their mother's death, when Martin moved his mistress, Gypsy Willis, into the family home, introducing her to the younger children as their new Manny. The lie was so brazen, so disrespectful. It was a declaration of war. The McNeil daughters transformed into relentless amateur detectives, dedicating themselves to uncovering the truth of their mother's death. They documented their father's lies, his inconsistent timelines, and his bizarre behavior. They discovered his long history of affairs and the true identity of the new signed Manny. They meticulously recorded every suspicious detail and relentlessly lobbied the Utah County Attorney's Office to take another look at the case. They refused to let their father get away with murder. Their persistence paid off. Investigators, armed with the daughter's detailed accounts, reopened the case. A new chief medical examiner reviewed the toxicology reports and found the combination of drugs in Michelle's system was not just unusual, it was a lethal cocktail that no responsible doctor would ever prescribe together. The levels were so high, they would have rendered her completely immobile and unable to save herself. The cause of death was changed from natural to undetermined. The trial in 2013 was a media sensation. With no direct physical evidence of a struggle, prosecutors built a powerful circumstantial case, focused on Martin's motive, his desperate desire to be with his mistress, and his means, his medical knowledge. His own children took the stand and testified against him, their powerful emotional accounts exposing their father's web of lies. In November 2013, a jury found Dr. Martin McNeil guilty of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 17 years to life in prison. On April 9, 2017, after losing his appeals, Martin McNeil was found unresponsive in the prison yard of the Utah State Prison. He had taken his own life. As of August 25, 2025, the case of Martin McNeil serves as a chilling warning that the most dangerous predators can often be found not in dark alleys, but hiding behind a mask of respectability, within the walls of a picture-perfect home. In a pediatric intensive care unit, the PCU, a nurse is a beacon of hope in a world of fear. They are the highly skilled, endlessly compassionate guardians of the most fragile lives. the steady hand that parents cling to when their child's life hangs in the balance. But what if one of these guardians is not an angel of mercy, but an angel of death? What if the nurse you trust with your sick baby is predator, secretly inducing catastrophic medical emergencies, just so she can play the hero who saves them? In the early 1980s, Janine Jones was a licensed vocational nurse at the Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas. She was known for her ability to handle the high-stress, life-or-death crises that were a daily reality in the PQ. She seemed to thrive on the adrenaline, always the first to react when a child went into distress. Her calm demeanor and quick actions often earning her the praise of doctors and the eternal gratitude of terrified parents. But behind the scenes, a different, far more sinister reputation was growing. Her colleagues began to notice a chilling and statistically impossible pattern. A terrifying number of infants were suffering sudden, inexplicable heart failures and bleeding episodes, but only during the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift. It became known as the death shift. And it was Janine Jones's shift. Her method was as simple as it was evil. She would secretly inject her tiny, helpless patients with powerful drugs that had not been prescribed to them. Her weapons of choice were succinylcholine, a potent muscle relaxant that paralyzes the respiratory system and stops a child's breathing within minutes, and heparin, a powerful anticoagulant that causes massive, uncontrollable internal bleeding. She would administer the poison, then wait for the inevitable code blue. As the infant's heart monitor blurred and the room exploded into chaos, Jones would be the first to the bedside, launching into dramatic life-saving procedures. Sometimes she would succeed, heroically reviving the child she had just tried to murder, basking in the glory of the moment. But just as often, she would fail, and the baby would die. Another tragic loss in the unforgiving world of pediatric intensive care. The other nurses knew something was terribly wrong. They tried to raise the alarm, presenting hospital administrators with the staggering statistics that proved the death shift was not a coincidence. But the hospital, terrified of a career-ending multi-million-dollar lawsuit, chose to protect its reputation instead of its patients. Rather than calling the police, they quietly conducted an internal inquiry and then simply asked all of their vocational nurses, including Jones, to resign. In a staggering act of institutional cowardice, they allegedly shredded documents and allowed a prolific serial killer of children to simply walk away and find new victims. In 1983, Jones took a job at a small private pediatric clinic in the nearby town of Kerrville, Texas. The dying immediately followed her. Within a month, 6 different children who had been given routine vaccinations by Jones suffered sudden, life-threatening emergencies. This time, however, a courageous physician, Dr. Kathleen Holland, refused to accept the impossible coincidences. After one of her patients, 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan, died following an injection from Jones, Dr. Holland found puncture marks on a vial succinylcholine in the clinic's drug locker, a drug that had absolutely no legitimate use in that office. She immediately took the evidence to the police, finally triggering the criminal investigation that the San Antonio hospital had worked so hard to avoid. The investigation was immensely difficult. Succinylcholine metabolizes so quickly in the body that it becomes almost undetectable just hours after death, a fact Jones likely knew from her medical training. But prosecutors, armed with Dr. Holland's evidence and the damning testimony of other parents, were determined. In 1984, Janine Jones was put on trial. While she was suspected of murdering up to 60 infants and children, the state could only build a solid case around one death. She was found guilty of the murder of Chelsea McClellan, and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. In a separate trial, she was sentenced to 60 years for injuring another child with a massive overdose of heparin. The story should have ended there, but a bizarre quirk in Texas law turned it into a ticking time bomb. A mandatory release law designed to alleviate prison overcrowding meant that even with a 99-year sentence, Jones was scheduled for automatic parole in March of 2018. The families of her victims and the prosecutors who had put her away were faced with the horrifying reality that a woman they believed to be one of history's most prolific child killers was about to be set free. This sparked a desperate last-ditch race against time. A new team of prosecutors reopened the cold cases from the 1980s, digging through old evidence and re-interviewing witnesses to find a way to keep her behind bars. Just months before her scheduled release, they succeeded, indicting her on 5 new murder charges for the deaths of other infants. In January 2020, to avoid another trial, Janine Jones pleaded guilty to the 1981 murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, who she had poisoned with a toxic dose of an anti-seizure drug. As part of the plea deal, she was sentenced to another term of life in prison. As of Monday, August 25, 2025, Janine Jones, now 74 years old, remains incarcerated in a Texas state prison, where she will now almost certainly die. Her case is a horrifying look at the angel of death phenomenon, and a damning indictment of a hospital system that chose to bury its secrets, along with the bodies of the innocent children it failed to protect. For the rich and the famous, the personal physician is the ultimate symbol of status and security. A doctor on call 24 hours a day, ready to cater to their every medical need, shielding them from the harsh realities of public life. But what happens when the doctor stops being a caregiver and becomes a paid enabler? What happens when a physician, blinded by the promise of a $150,000 a month salary, breaks every fundamental rule in the medical playbook to satisfy the dangerous demands of the most famous man on earth? In 2009, Dr. Conrad Murray, a successful cardiologist with clinics in Las Vegas and Houston, landed the job of a lifetime. He was hired to be the exclusive personal physician for the king of pop, Michael Jackson. Jackson was in the final grueling weeks of rehearsals for his monumental comeback tour. This is it, a series of 50 planned concerts in London that would be the biggest and most spectacular of his career. The pressure on the 50-year-old superstar was immense. He was physically frail, and years of a grueling nocturnal lifestyle had left him with a case of chronic, debilitating insomnia. Dr. Murray's job was not just to manage Jackson's health. His primary, explicit task was to make sure Michael Jackson slept. No matter what it took, was a staggering and unprecedented breach of medical ethics and human safety. Night after night, in the master bedroom of Jackson's rented Holmby Hills mansion, Dr. Murray would transform the pop star's private quarters into a makeshift, unregulated anesthesiology suite. His treatment for Jackson's insomnia was a drug called propofol, a powerful, milky white liquid anesthetic used to induce and maintain unconsciousness during major surgery in a hospital operating room. Jackson, who had become psychologically dependent on the drug, called it his propofol. Murray would connect an IV bag of saline to Jackson's arm, and then, using a syringe, he would manually push the lethal anesthetic into the line until the star fell asleep. Administering propofol outside of a hospital setting is medical malpractice of the highest order. The drug is so potent that it can cause a patient to stop breathing and go into cardiac arrest in an instant. It requires constant, second-by-second monitoring of a patient's vital signs by a trained anesthesiologist with a full suite of emergency resuscitation equipment, including oxygen, heart monitors, and a defibrillator at the ready. Dr. Conrad Murray had none of this. He was monitoring his patient with a simple fingertip pulse oximeter that he often didn't even look at. He had no backup equipment. He was, in effect, playing Russian roulette with the life of the most famous man in the world, night after night. On the morning of June 25, 2009, the game ended. After a long night of rehearsals, Jackson was agitated and unable to sleep. Murray had already given him a cocktail of other powerful sedatives, including Valium, Ativan, and Versed, but nothing was working. Finally, at approximately 10:40 a.m., Murray administered the propofol. He later told police that he only left Jackson's side for 2 minutes to use the bathroom. But phone records showed a different story. He was on the phone with his girlfriend and his medical practice, sending texts and emails, completely neglecting the unconscious man under his care. When he finally looked up from his phone, he saw the horrifying truth. Michael Jackson was no longer breathing. What followed was a masterclass in panic, incompetence, and selfish deception. Instead of immediately calling 911, Murray's first instinct was to cover his tracks. He began frantically gathering the vials of propofol and other drugs, hiding them in a bag to conceal the evidence of his gross negligence. He then began performing CPR, but he did it incorrectly, on top of a soft bed instead of a hard surface, and used only one hand. It was nearly 25 minutes after he found Jackson unresponsive that a security guard was finally instructed to call for help. When paramedics arrived, Murray repeatedly lied to them. He claimed he had only given Jackson a small amount of lorazepam and failed to mention the propofol, withholding the one piece of information that the emergency room doctors needed to have any chance of saving his life. The truth, however, could not stay hidden. Investigators found the stashed bags of medication, and the toxicology report revealed the lethal dose of propofol in Jackson's system. The trial of Dr. Conrad Murray in 2011 was a global media spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as a reckless and greedy doctor who was completely out of his depth, a man so starstruck and desperate for his massive salary that he abandoned all medical reason. They argued that his actions were not a simple mistake, but a game of gross negligence that he played every single night, and on June 25th, he lost. The defense argued that Jackson was a desperate drug addict who, in a moment of frustration, likely self-addonated the final fatal dose of propofol while Murray was out of the room. The jury did not believe him. After a 6-week trial, they found Dr. Conrad Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to the maximum of 4 years in county jail. His medical licenses in Texas, California, and Nevada were either revoked or suspended. Dr. Conrad Murray was released from prison in October of 2013 after serving just 2 years of his 4-year sentence due to a California law aimed at reducing prison overcrowding. As of Monday, August 25, 2025, he remains a pariah in the medical community, his name forever linked to one of the most famous deaths in modern history. His case stands as a tragic and cautionary tale of how the intoxicating allure of fame and money can cause a doctor to completely abandon their sacred oath, with world-shaking consequences. Every career has its setbacks: a harsh review, a lost promotion, or the painful sting of being fired. For most people, it's a professional wound that eventually heals, a chapter that closes. But what happens when a brilliant doctor's ego is so profoundly shattered by failure that he refuses to move on? What happens when his resentment is allowed to fester for years in the dark, cultivating a cold, patient, and murderous thirst for revenge against the very people he blames for his downfall? Dr. Anthony Garcia was, by all accounts, a highly intelligent man who possessed the raw intellect to be a successful physician. However, that intellect was paired with a toxic arrogance and a complete inability to handle criticism. His journey through the world of medicine was a trail of burned bridges and failed opportunities. He bounced from residency program to residency program, leaving a wake of complaints about his unprofessional behavior, his laziness, and his combative attitude. In 2001, this pattern of failure culminated in his termination from the prestigious pathology residency program at Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha, Nebraska. For Garcia, this was not just a career setback. It was a catastrophic personal humiliation, and he fixated on the two doctors who signed his dismissal letter, Dr. William Hunter and Dr. Roger Brombach. They became the living symbols of his ruined life. For 7 years, Garcia's life continued its downward spiral. He was unable to hold a steady job, fell deep into debt, and his simmering rage against Creighton University grew into a murderous obsession. In March of 2008, he decided it was time for the first act of his revenge. He drove to Omaha and broke into the upscale home of Dr. William Hunter. But Dr. Hunter wasn't there. Instead, Garcia found his 13-year-old son Thomas and the family's beloved 57-year-old housekeeper, Shirley Sherman. In a horrific act of displaced vengeance, Garcia brutally murdered them both, stabbing them repeatedly with a knife. He then staged the scene to look like a botched home invasion, creating a crime that was as baffling as it was tragic. For 5 long years, the case went cold, a horrifying mystery that left the city of Omaha terrified and the Hunter family destroyed. Police had no suspects and no discernible motive. During those 5 years, Garcia continued to drift, his rage still unsated. Finally, in May of 2013, he returned to Omaha to finish his mission. He broke into the home of the second man on his list, Dr. Roger Brombach. He was now the chief of pathology at the university. This time, his target was home. Garcia murdered the 65-year-old doctor and his wife, Mary, in the same savage manner as his first 2 victims, stabbing them to death and again attempting to make the crime look like a random robbery. But this time, he had made a crucial mistake. The second double homicide, with its identical method and a high-profile victim from the same university department, was too much of a coincidence. Investigators immediately connected the 2013 Brombach murders with the 2008 Hunter and Sherman murders. They realized this was not the work of a random burglar. This was a targeted campaign of assassination. The only logical link between the victims was the Creighton University Pathology Department. Detectives compiled a list of every resident who had been terminated from the program over the past 2 decades. One name stood out: Dr. Anthony Garcia, the man who had been fired by both Dr. Hunter and Dr. Brombach. A nationwide manhunt was launched. Investigators tracked Garcia's digital and financial footprints, discovering that he had been near Omaha during both sets of murders. His cell phone records placed him in the area, and they even found a record of him calling a local restaurant on the day the Brombachs were killed. The puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place, revealing a portrait of a patient, methodical, and vengeful killer. 2 months later, Garcia was pulled over for a routine traffic stop in southern Illinois. He was drunk, and in his car, police found a .45 caliber handgun and a high-capacity magazine. He was arrested, and the long, cold case of the Omaha slayings had finally found its prime suspect. The trial was built on a mountain of circumstantial evidence that, when woven together, told an undeniable story of revenge. Prosecutors laid out Garcia's history of failure, his festering grudge against the doctors who fired him, and the chilling timeline that placed him at the scene of both crimes. They portrayed him as a man on a mission, a narcissistic killer who believed that the only way to reclaim his own sense of power was to brutally extinguish the lives of those he held responsible for his humiliation, including their innocent family members. In 2016, a jury found Dr. Anthony Garcia guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. For his meticulously planned and brutally executed acts of vengeance, he was sentenced to death. As of Monday, August 25, 2025, Anthony Garcia sits on death row in the Nebraska State Penitentiary, awaiting his execution. His case is a terrifying study in professional resentment turned homicidal, a chilling reminder that a brilliant mind, when warped by a shattered ego and an insatiable thirst for revenge, can become capable of the most patient and brutal acts imaginable. In the high-stakes world of spinal surgery, a surgeon's hands are everything. They are instruments of immense precision and skill, capable of repairing the most delicate structures of the human body, relieving agonizing pain, and restoring a patient's quality of life. Patients place an absolute, almost sacred trust in that skill. But what happens when that surgeon is not a healer, but a butcher? What happens when a man with a scalpel, a god complex, and a trail of wrecked lives is allowed to continue operating, long after it becomes clear that he is a clear and present danger to anyone who goes under his knife? Dr. Christopher Duntsch arrived in Dallas, Texas, with a glittering resume and a tsunami of self-confidence. He claimed to have a combined MD and FE, boasted of a brilliant career in medical research in Memphis, and marketed himself as one of the best and most innovative spine surgeons in the field. He was charismatic, arrogant, and incredibly persuasive, quickly gaining operating privileges at multiple hospitals in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. To his new patients, many of whom were suffering from debilitating back pain, he was a miracle worker, a brilliant doctor who promised to give them their lives back. In reality, they were putting their lives in the hands of a monster who would earn the nickname Dr. Death. Duntsch's operating room was a theater of horrors. Surgeons who were forced to assist him watched in disbelief as he committed acts of medical butchery that were not just incompetent, but seemed almost intentionally malevolent. He would operate on the wrong part of the spine, sever major arteries, and leave instruments inside his patients. He sliced through the vocal cords of one patient during a routine fusion, leaving her able to speak only in a whisper. He left another patient, his own childhood friend, a quadriplegic, after inexplicably severing a vertebral artery. During one procedure, a fellow surgeon had to physically pull Duntsch's instruments out of his hands to stop him from continuing to harm the patient on the table. The trail of carnage was staggering and undeniable. In less than 2 years, he operated on 38 patients in the Dallas area. Of those, 33 were left with permanent, life-altering injuries, and 2 were killed. His patients would enter the operating room for routine procedures and emerge as paraplegics, quadriplegics, or in chronic, agonizing pain, far worse than what they had before. He was a one-man plague on the medical community, leaving a wake of shattered lives wherever he went. Yet, unbelievably, he was allowed to continue operating. The system that was supposed to protect patients failed at every conceivable level. When one hospital, Baylor Plano, finally revoked his privileges after he maimed multiple patients, they did not report him to the National Practitioner Databank, the federal clearinghouse designed to track dangerous doctors. Instead, they wrote him a letter stating there were no issues with his performance, allowing him to simply walk across the street and get a temporary job at Dallas Medical Center. It was there that he would kill his second patient, 63-year-old Floella Brown, by cutting a major vein and then packing it with so much coagulant that it blocked blood flow to her brain. The fight to stop Dr. Death was not led by hospital administrators or medical boards, but by 2 heroic physicians who saw the horror firsthand: Dr. Robert Henderson and Dr. Randall Kirby. Both surgeons had been called in to try and repair the catastrophic damage Duntsch had inflicted on his patients. They were so horrified by what they saw Vertebrae fused together in the wrong places, screws drilled into muscle instead of bone, and nerves that had been intentionally severed, that they made it their personal mission to bring him down. They began a relentless campaign, writing letters, making phone calls, and lobbying the Texas Medical Board to finally take action. They described Duntsch not as an incompetent surgeon, but as a sociopath who knew exactly what he was doing. Thanks to their efforts, the Texas Medical Board finally suspended his license in June of 2013. But the damage was already done. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office then launched a criminal investigation, a rare move in cases of medical malpractice. They built a case arguing that Duntsch's actions were not just mistakes, but intentional acts of aggravated assault. They had a mountain of evidence, including horrified emails between nurses and doctors who had witnessed his surgeries, and the powerful, heartbreaking testimony of his victims. In 2017, Christopher Duntsch was put on trial. One by one, his former patients took the stand, many in wheelchairs, and described in gut-wrenching detail how he had destroyed their lives. The jury saw the CT scans, the mangled spines, and the evidence of his almost unbelievable incompetence. They found him guilty of injury to an elderly person for his botched surgery on 74-year-old Mary Farid, who was left permanently paralyzed. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. As of Monday, August 25th, 2025, Christopher Duntsch is serving his life sentence at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. His case, made famous by the podcast and TV series Dr. Death, is a terrifying look at how a charismatic sociopath with a scalpel was able to exploit a broken system. It's a story not just of one evil doctor, but of the institutional cowardice that allowed him to continue his reign of terror, and the heroic doctors who fought to stop him. The doctor's oath, the sacred vow to do no harm, is the ethical bedrock of all medicine. It is a promise to heal, to comfort, and to preserve life against all odds. But what happens when that oath is not just broken, but inverted? What happens when a doctor, armed with immense knowledge and a state-sanctioned license to kill, uses his medical authority not to heal, but to torture, mutilate, and exterminate? What happens when a man shuds his humanity and becomes the angel of death? Before the war, Dr. Josef Mengele was a man of immense promise. The son of a wealthy German industrialist, he was a sophisticated and ambitious academic who earned 2 doctorates, one in medicine and another in anthropology. He was intelligent, handsome, and on a path to becoming a celebrated scientist and university professor. But his intellectual pursuits were poisoned by his fanatical devotion to the Nazi Party's twisted racial ideology. When World War II broke out, he saw an opportunity not just to serve his country, but to pursue his grotesque research with a captive and completely disposable population of human subjects. In 1943, Mengele was transferred to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. It was here that he found his true calling as a monster. As one of the chief SS physicians, he was given absolute power over the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jewish, Romani, and other prisoners. His most visible and infamous duty was performing selections on the train platform as new transports of prisoners arrived. Dressed in a pristine white coat, he would stand with an air of detached arrogance, whistling a cheerful opera aria as he surveyed the terrified men, women, and children. With a simple flick of his finger, to the left or to the right, he would decide who was fit for slave labor and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. It was a daily act of mass murder that he performed with the casual indifference of a farmer sorting livestock. But the gas chambers were not his primary interest. Auschwitz was his personal human laboratory. Became obsessed with grotesque and sadistic medical experiments, all performed without anesthesia and with a complete disregard for human suffering. He saw them as the key to unlocking the secrets of heredity and multiplying the Aryan race. He would have his guards scour the incoming transports, pulling aside any set of twins they could find. These children, who he chillingly called Mengele's twins, were housed in special barracks where they were subjected to horrors beyond imagination. He would inject one twin with a deadly pathogen, like typhus or tuberculosis, and leave the other as a control. When the infected twin died, he would murder the healthy twin with a direct injection of chloroform to the heart so he could perform a simultaneous autopsy, comparing their organs. He performed blood transfusions between them, sewed them together to create artificial conjoined twins, and attempted to change their eye color by injecting chemicals like adrenaline directly into their eyeballs, a process that caused agonizing pain, infection, and often blindness. When the experiments were concluded, the subjects were always killed and dissected. His depravity knew no bounds. He conducted experiments on dwarfs and people with physical abnormalities. He would inflict wounds on prisoners and deliberately infect them with bacteria to induce gangrene, studying the progression of the decay. He performed brutal sterilization experiments on men and women, using surgery, X-rays, and chemical injections, all in an attempt to find an efficient way to stop the reproduction of those the Nazis deemed undesirable. His work had no genuine scientific value. It was sadistic torture masquerading as research, a doctor's perverse curiosity, unleashed in a world without consequences. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, Josef Mengele, the man responsible for the murder and torture of thousands, simply vanished. He was briefly captured by American forces, but was released, his identity not yet fully understood. Using a sophisticated network of former Nazi sympathizers known as the Brack Lines, he managed to escape from Germany. He fled to Argentina, and then to Paraguay and Brazil, living for decades under various aliases, always one step ahead of the Nazi hunters who were trying to track him down. The global manhunt, including efforts by Israel's Mossad, repeatedly failed. He was protected, well funded by his family back in Germany, and the political will to find one of the world's most wanted men often seemed to waver. The angel of death was never brought to justice. He was never forced to stand trial and answer for his crimes. On February 7th, 1979, while living under an alias in a coastal resort town in Brazil, the 67-year-old Mengele went for a swim, suffered a massive stroke in the water, and drowned. It was a quiet, pathetic, and infuriatingly mundane end for a man who had inflicted so much suffering on the world. His identity was not definitively confirmed until his remains were exhumed and identified through forensic testing in 1985. As of Monday, August 25, 2025, the name Josef Mengele is not just a footnote in history. It is a synonym for pure, unadulterated evil. He represents the ultimate and most absolute corruption of medicine, a chilling warning that when science is divorced from humanity and empowered by a genocidal ideology, it can become the most powerful instrument of suffering the world has ever known. From the wandering poisoner to the Nazi angel of death, these 10 cases reveal the terrifying ways the sacred trust between a doctor and a patient can be twisted into a weapon. They are the healers who became killers, the guardians who became monsters, leaving a legacy of shattered lives and a chilling reminder that the most profound evil can hide behind a white coat. If you made it this far and want to keep exploring the darkest truths of the criminal world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support is what allows us to keep digging.